Okay, so your rent went up again, and your landlord blamed the market. Supply and demand, they said. Nothing personal. Here's the thing though, your landlord probably didn't set that number. A piece of software did. And so did your neighbor's landlord, and the landlord 3 buildings down. All of them quietly asking the same algorithm what to charge. You'd assume that's just efficient business, a computer doing math faster than a human could. It's not that. And once you see what it's actually doing, you'll understand why the Department of Justice showed up with a lawsuit and eventually the FBI showed up with a warrant. I'm going to show you the part that turns efficient pricing into something federal prosecutors called a cartel, but not yet. First, meet the company, because the setup makes the twist land a lot harder. This is zero sum. Let's open the ledger. The company is called RealPage, and its pricing software goes by a name that sounds almost cheerful, YieldStar. Here's how it's supposed to work in theory. A landlord who owns an apartment building feeds RealPage their data: rents, vacancies, lease lengths, renewal rates. RealPage crunches it, and every single day it spits out a recommended price for every open unit. The landlord can't ignore it. Nobody's forcing anyone to say yes. Except almost everyone says yes. Multiple investigations found landlords accept the software's price somewhere between 80 and 90% of the time, which is a strange thing to call optional. And here's the part that turns this from one company's product into a nationwide pattern. RealPage doesn't just serve one landlord in your city. By 2020, it was pricing nearly 20 million rental units across the country. Not every rental in America, single-family homes and mom-and-pop basement suites aren't really in this picture, but of the professionally managed apartment market, the big commercial buildings run by property management companies, that works out to somewhere close to 40% running through the exact same software. So think about what that actually means for a second. In a normal market, if your landlord tries to charge too much, you walk down the street to a competitor with a lower price, and eventually the guy overcharging has to come down. That's supposed to be the whole point of competition. But if 40% of the landlords in your area are all plugged into the exact same brain, there's no competitor to walk to. There's just the same recommendation dressed up as 10 different buildings. In Seattle, ProPublica found one neighborhood where the 10 biggest property managers controlled 70% of the units, and every single one of them used RealPage. In Atlanta, more than 80% of rentals run through software-based pricing, and since 2016, rent in that city has climbed roughly 80%. Vacancies went up. Prices did not come down, which in a normal market should never happen at the same time. Empty apartments are supposed to be the one thing that forces prices lower. That's your first clue that something in this system isn't behaving like a normal market. But it's not the twist yet. Before the twist, one more detail, because it's the closest thing this story has to an actual smoke-filled room. RealPage runs something called a user group. More than 1,000 landlord and property manager members, with subcommittees specifically dedicated to pricing. They meet in private at annual conferences to discuss and suggest improvements to the very software that's supposedly just doing neutral math on their behalf. Picture that meeting for a second. A room full of competitors who are legally not supposed to talk to each other about pricing, sitting in the same conference room discussing pricing, through the polite fiction that they're really just discussing software features. Legal experts flagged this group specifically as a red flag, because if you squint, a private meeting of 1,000 competing landlords talking shop about their shared pricing tool looks an awful lot like the exact thing antitrust law was written to stop, just with better catering. Here's the twist. Imagine you're a landlord with an empty apartment. Common sense says lower the price, fill the unit, collect rent. An empty apartment earning $0 is worse than a full one earning slightly less. RealPage's own architects told landlords the opposite. Jeffrey Roper, the software engineer who built YieldStar's core pricing logic, told ProPublica the whole point was to get landlords comfortable with the idea that felt wrong at first, that a building could make more money running at a lower occupancy rate, leaving units empty deliberately, than filling every single one at a fair price. And it wasn't just theory. Rick Campo, the CEO of Camden Property Trust, one of the country's largest apartment landlords, told investors on an earnings call that pushing rents harder, even though it meant 15% more tenants moving out and needing to be replaced, still generated an extra $10 million in net income. Senator Warren later cited that exact call in a formal letter demanding answers from RealPage. An empty unit used to be treated as a failure. The software and the landlords who trusted it treated it as a strategy. Leave the apartment empty. Let the vacancy sit there, doing nothing, costing you nothing you can make back, and raise the price on everyone else instead. Sit with that for a second, because it's genuinely the same trick you've seen on this channel before. It's not a prison paying for an empty bed, it's a landlord who would rather look at an empty apartment than actually lower the rent, because the algorithm has already calculated that emptiness is more profitable than fairness. An empty home, sitting there, on purpose, so that yours costs more. That's not bad luck. That's not the market. That's the business model. Okay, deep breath. Let's talk about how much that actually costs you, because the number attached to this isn't small. Rent nationwide has outpaced overall inflation by roughly 40% over the past decade, and in markets where RealPage's fingerprints are heaviest, the increases have been sharper still, sometimes in double digits in a single year. At one real estate conference, when a RealPage executive was directly asked if the software was driving rent hikes as high as 14.5% in some markets, he didn't deny it. He said, and I'm paraphrasing only slightly, "Yeah, I think we're driving that, honestly." Which is a bold thing to admit out loud at a conference, but also, credit where it's due, refreshingly honest for an industry that usually blames the market instead of the spreadsheet. And here's a small, almost funny detail buried in all of this. RealPage's own marketing aimed at landlords warned that if you weren't using its software, you might be, quote, leaving money on the table by being too quick to lower rents when a unit sat empty. Read that again slowly. The company's actual sales pitch to landlords was, don't be so hasty about helping your tenants. It's basically an ad that says, stop being reasonable. It's costing you money. And somehow that was the pitch, not the warning label. So naturally, the government noticed. Eventually. It started in May of 2024 when the FBI actually raided one of RealPage's biggest customers, a national landlord called Cortland Management, which alone owned roughly 85,000 apartment units. Federal agents showing up in person at a leasing company's headquarters is not the kind of thing that happens over a purely theoretical concern. It happens when investigators think there's something worth seizing before it disappears. 3 months later, in August of 2024, the Department of Justice, joined by 8 states, sued RealPage, arguing the software let landlords swap competitively sensitive information and coordinate pricing in a way that looks a whole lot like the thing antitrust law exists to stop, just with better catering. The raid wasn't a random escalation. It was the government building its case before it ever walked into court. And this is where the story starts feeling less like a lawsuit and more like a slow-motion game of whack-a-mole. Landlords started settling one by one. Greystar, the single largest landlord in the single country, agreed to pay $50 million to settle a class-action lawsuit in Tennessee federal court, plus another $7 million to a group of states. Cities got involved too. Philadelphia and Seattle both passed local bans on algorithmic rent setting. New York and California signed statewide laws last year making the practice illegal outright. And then, in November of 2025, RealPage itself settled with the federal government. Here's the part that should feel familiar if you've watched this channel before. No damages, no fine, no admission that anything it did was wrong.
The company agreed to some real changes. It can't use rent data less than a year old anymore, it can't see real-time lease numbers, it can't slice pricing down to a single building, only a whole state at a time. A court-appointed monitor is watching for the next 7 years, which is a genuinely meaningful set of restrictions. But notice what didn't happen. Nobody who overpaid rent for the last several years gets a check. The system gets a new rulebook. The bill from the old one just stays with whoever already paid it. So here's the full ledger, and by now the shape of it should feel familiar. On one side, a $9 billion software company sold to a private equity firm for over $10 billion, whose founder walked away worth close to $2 billion. Property managers who, by their own executive's account, learned to treat an empty apartment as a feature, not a problem. On the other, tens of millions of renters in cities where 40, 70, sometimes 80% of the market was quietly pricing off the same recommendation, paying rent increases that outpaced their wages in apartments that stayed empty right next door to them on purpose, because filling those units for less money was worse for the math than leaving them dark. Every dollar in that gap has an address, and it isn't the software's. Think about how strange that actually is once you say it out loud. You didn't lose a negotiation with your landlord. You never even got one.
The number was decided before you walked in the door, by a room full of competitors who were legally supposed to be competing, using a tool that made sure none of them ever really had to. A casino needs you to walk back onto the floor. A private prison needs a signature on a contract. A landlord's algorithm doesn't even need a signature. It just needs everyone on your block to be quietly asking the same question and getting back the same answer. Before you ever toured the apartment, before you ever signed the lease, before you even knew the building next door had an empty unit sitting there on purpose, the number was already decided. You just didn't know who said it.